Hi, I'm Marc Lynch, Director of the Project on Middle East Political Science and the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University. Welcome back to the POMEPS Conversations, our series of discussions with leading scholars in the field. With me today is Toby Matthiesen of University of Cambridge with a new book, Sectarian Gulf, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and the Arab Spring That Wasn't. Welcome, Toby.
Thank you very much.
So why don't we start just by talking about the book itself? You argue that, that sectarianism is a political strategy for these regimes. Tell us why you think that is.
Because I think clearly cultural differences and religious differences can always lead to animosities between people or your neighbors or so on. But usually these don't cause real problems unless I think they're backed or they're being used for larger political struggles. And as I think in the Gulf in particular, and actually the wider region, now regimes have used sectarian divisions to kind of strengthen or their rule and to survive these Arab uprisings.
Well, how does that work specifically? Like, explain how sectarianism helps these regimes hold on to power.
Well, for example, the protests in Bahrain in February 2011 were actually mainly directed against the Bahraini Prime Minister, who had been there since independence from the British in the early 70s. Because he was personally attacked, and many people see him as still the most powerful person in Bahrain, then started to attack the protesters as purely Shia, foreign-directed, Iranian, and so on. And how this works is that and I would call him and other people like him in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and across the region sectarian identity entrepreneurs. They then tell journalists or editors-in-chiefs of newspapers, of TV channels to portray this line, and then it gets spread around the region.
And so why does it work? Why are people so willing to believe this entrepreneurship?
Well, I mean, there is still a large group of people who doesn't believe this, but it becomes increasingly difficult to speak out against this kind of sectarian hatred because the people who try to cross this sectarian divide during these moments of heightened tension, like we've seen now since 2011, get targeted specifically for trying to cross the sectarian divide. And we've seen that particularly of vicious attacks on Sunnis in Bahrain who solidarized themselves with the protests, and on Sunnis in Saudi who did the same. And actually on other people, for example, people from the Kuwaiti Muslim Brotherhood, for example, who solidarized themselves with Bahrain, or so anybody who doesn't subscribe to this notion really gets attacked very viciously. And on the other hand, I mean, as I said, of course, there are underlying polemics that have gone back centuries and so on in the religious discourse, and I mean, in particularly in Saudi Arabia, the view of the Shia is very low, so it's quite easy to somehow say that there are crazy suspicions around them, that they're not clean and so on. You shouldn't even talk to them. You shouldn't even go to their areas because they might kill you. Or great misconceptions persist, and that obviously facilitates the instrumentalization of these identities.
Now, you see this as both a domestic survival strategy and also as an instrument of regional foreign policy.
Yes. It obviously plays into the anti-Iran narrative that the Americans and the Israelis mainly are kind of spreading across the region now for a long time. And in the past, there have been instances where Iran supported Gulf Shia opposition movements, mainly in the 80s. And what, for example, especially the Bahrainis are trying to do is really trying to link this 2011 to what happened mainly in 1981 when one of the Shia opposition groups, the Shirazis, tried to do a coup in Bahrain. So that actually happened, but now we're 30 years later, something totally different happened, and these Shirazis are just really a very small minority of the Shia in Bahrain. Now the Bahrainis tried to say, okay, this was led by them, it's a continuation of that coup. People are being imprisoned for stuff they've written about the coup even. And for example, when I was in Bahrain in February 2011, they started showing old pictures of and the pamphlets that these opposition movements produced in the 80s on TV to kind of try to show that what's going on now is exactly like then.
Now, one of the points you make is that there was actually quite a lot of mobilization across the Gulf in early 2011. That it wasn't, that you argue against the notion that the Gulf somehow escaped the Arab uprisings.
Yes, I think the Gulf, as any other country in the region, was profoundly affected by what happened. And I mean, the protests are just one side of it, and may not even be the most important one. I mean, we've seen new kind of forms of contention across the spectrum, and social media is certainly one of the areas where we've seen a huge explosion of Twitter, as you know, but everything else as well, particularly in Saudi, but really in every country. So things that were taboo 2 years ago are not taboo anymore. And if you're an authoritarian regime or almost totalitarian regime that wants to, really control what people say in public, you can never control what people think, but most of these regimes have been pretty good at controlling at what people say in public. So this has completely broken down over the last 2 years. So I think, and at the same time, the governments have really thrown so much money at this problem. At all the problems, basically, increased minimum wages, created hundreds of thousands of jobs in places where they're not needed, or mainly in the securities sectors, and have thereby so increased their budgets, things that will be very difficult to reduce once oil prices are a bit lower. Because giving someone a job in the Ministry of Interior is very easy, someone you want to co-opt. But when you want to kick 50,000 people out of the Ministry of Interior, and they're kind of, the people that should protect your state, it's very difficult to do that.
Now, the title of the book, Sectarian Gulf, but if you look at the 6 countries of the GCC, I think it's fair to say that UAE and Qatar really didn't have significant mobilization. Oman and Kuwait did have significant mobilization, but it wasn't primarily framed around sectarian lines. And it's really Bahrain and Saudi Arabia that you're focused on, is that right?
Yes, I guess the argument comes from the Bahraini and Saudi experience, hence, right. The subtitle Bahrain, Saudi Arabia and the Arab Spring that wasn't. I mean, the subtitle, I thereby mean the Arab Spring that wasn't really allowed to happen in the Gulf. That was my initial idea, but now that we see how, the Arab Spring is being crushed across the region, maybe it's taking on other significance. But the idea for the book actually really emerged when I was in Kuwait, because I was quite frustrated by, obviously, the crackdown in Bahrain, and I had written a PhD on the Shia in Saudi Arabia, so I knew what was going on. But I was only just in Kuwait, when I went there in early 2012, that I saw how much this Bahrain uprising had divided Shia and Sunni in another state with actually completely different political history, which shouldn't necessarily, be involved in that. But I found out that, almost all the Shia were completely on the side of the Bahraini opposition, and the Sunnis had completely adopted this sectarian narrative that I was, that I had also experienced. So, and the same actually across the region, even in Lebanon, people, kind of were seeing this in this light. So, yeah.
How do you know whether this was a conscious regime strategy versus something which developed from the ground up? I mean, were Kuwaiti Sunnis and Shias dividing because the Kuwaiti regime pushed them in that direction? Or was this more of an autonomous response to developments elsewhere in the region?
I think, I don't think the Kuwaiti royal family pushed, this narrative so much, even though, their sectarian divisions also helped to divide the opposition. There was a reform bloc of Shia and Sunni opposition politicians in the mid-2000s that was actually quite threatening to the current form of monarchy. But I think the distinct strategy happened in Bahrain and Saudi, but then some influential people in Kuwait, businessmen and MPs, took up this narrative. And yeah, I mean, there are also Shia identity entrepreneurs who try to unify the Shia community, and they were quite closely linked to the former Prime Minister, Sheikh Nasser. So you have dynamics going on that point in a similar direction.
Now, I think that most of us see sectarianism, and certainly the tone of the book is that the sectarianism is a bad thing, that this is in some way an illegitimate, undesirable form of political identity and mobilization. But is there any reason to think that it won't work, that it won't actually keep these regimes in power for the foreseeable future? I mean, if you were sitting on these thrones, why would you think that this strategy that's worked for so long won't continue to work?
Well, let's assume it would work. They have, targeted this particular group of people, the Gulf Shia, more or less as a group, and described them as this fifth column that's responsible for all the problems. Now, you would think that would align the ruling families with the Sunni Islamists, who also sometimes have a sectarian outlook. And if you look at what's going on in Syria, you see a certain alignment between what the governments are doing and pushing for an intervention, and what the people want. But actually, you see a total discord between the Sunni Islamists and the ruling families, and you see that clearly over the coup in Egypt. So, for example, in Saudi Arabia, the most prominent, Sunni Islamists who are not, inside the Wahhabi establishment have started to criticize the royal family very openly, have called for a constitutional monarchy, and were really clearly aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood across the region. So, if we were thinking that this was really going to work, then the ruling families would have had to find a new deal with the rest of the population, and I think initiate also some political reforms to give them something in return, and we haven't seen any of that.
So you don't think that this is sustainable for Bahrain and Saudi Arabia in the medium term?
I think it's a xenophobic strategy of blaming one group for all the ills, and it might work for a while, but it's not a solution for countries that actually share many of the problems that the Arab Spring countries have. Of course, they have much more resources at their hand, but youth unemployment is very high. Divisions between regions, economic divisions are pretty high. Regional identities are very strong. And particularly Saudi Arabia has had a very hard time in creating something like Saudi nationalism, or something, a notion of being together based on Saudi citizenship. And actually some of the Shia intellectuals were kind of the main propagandists of a Saudi nationalism, who wrote dozens of books, hundreds of articles on this topic, and now they're being targeted in this way. So I think at the moment it's just about survival, so I don't think these strategies are actually very long-term and thought through.
All right, well, thank you, Toby Matthiesen, author of Sectarian Gulf. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.